Professor Alistair Finch stood at the center of the stage, a magnificent predator in his natural habitat. The light from the overhead spots caught the silver in his temples and the self-satisfied glint in his eyes, transforming him into a creature of pure, unadulterated intellect. Before him, the cavernous maw of the Atherton Auditorium sat in rapt silence. Hundreds of faces, students, academics, admirers, were turned upward, hungry for the pearls of wisdom that would inevitably fall from his lips. The air was thick with the scent of old books, lemon polish, and the collective exhalation of hero worship. It was the final day of the annual symposium on post-structural metaphysics, and Finch's keynote address was its crowning jewel. He was not just a speaker, he was the event. His domain was a world of ink and theory, and within its borders, his rule was absolute. He paused, letting the silence stretch, a conductor savoring the hush before the crescendo. His lecture centered on his life's work, the academic text that had catapulted him from obscurity to stardom. The Obsidian Mirror, a quantum reflection on being. The book was a dense, labyrinthine masterpiece, a work so profound that entire university departments had been founded just to unravel its meaning. And he, Alistair Finch, was its master interpreter. Tonight, however, he had planned a special flourish, a bit of theatrical cruelty that he believed would elevate his lecture into legend. He cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the hall like a gavel falling. "In every great work," he began, his voice a rich, sonorous baritone that commanded attention, "there are shadows, echoes of dissent, claims of madness. The brighter the light a work casts, the darker the delusions that gather at its edges." A murmur of intrigued anticipation rippled through the audience. Finch smiled. He had them. In the front row, a man sat perfectly still, a small, quiet island in a sea of academic reverence. His name was Elias Vance. He wore a simple gray work shirt, its cuffs frayed from years of labor, and trousers that had seen better decades. His hands, resting on his knees, were gnarled and calloused, the knuckles swollen like old tree roots. They were not the hands of a writer, but of a man who fixed things, who cleaned things, who worked with the solid, unforgiving materials of the world. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, etched with lines of patience and a sorrow so deep it had become a part of his bone structure. Yet his eyes were clear, a pale, startling blue, and they were fixed on Professor Finch with an unnerving, placid intensity. He did not look angry or intimidated. He looked like a stone wall waiting patiently for a storm to break against it. Finch's gaze swept the room before landing, as if by accident, on the unassuming figure in the front row. He feigned surprise, a practiced bit of stagecraft. "It seems we have one such shadow with us tonight, a rather persistent one, I must admit." He gestured magnanimously toward Elias. "This gentleman, Mr. Elias Vance, has on several occasions made a rather extraordinary claim. He has written to the university. He has written to my publisher. He has even, on one occasion, approached me after a lecture." Finch leaned forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that was nonetheless perfectly amplified by the microphone. "Mr. Vance here believes that he is the author of The Obsidian Mirror." He delivered the line and then stood back, a faint mocking smirk playing on his lips as the intended shockwave rolled through the audience. It was followed by a ripple of confused, then derisive laughter. The idea was preposterous. It was absurd. This simple, working-class man, this janitor, for Finch had made sure to find out his occupation, claiming to have authored a work of genius that scholars with minds like honed razors struggled to comprehend. The juxtaposition was a joke, and Finch was its gleeful teller. Elias Vance did not flinch. He did not shrink under the weight of hundreds of mocking eyes. The laughter washed over him, and he remained as he was, still and centered. He had known this would happen. He had anticipated the scorn, the disbelief. It was the price of truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. He had spent years in silence, a prisoner of his own fractured mind, while another man wore his soul like a stolen coat. The silence had become unbearable. Tonight he had come not for a fight, but for a reckoning. Finch let the laughter subside, raising a hand for quiet, the benevolent master calming his disciples. Now, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Let us hear the man out. It's the academic way, is it not? To examine all possibilities, no matter how fanciful. He turned his full attention on Elias, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Vance, please stand. Indulge us. Tell this esteemed audience your story. Tell them how you, a man of humble means and, I suspect, humble education, came to pen a 900-page treatise on the ontological implications of quantum superposition. The air crackled with tension. This was no longer a lecture. It was a public dissection, a sacrifice laid upon the altar of Finch's ego. Slowly, deliberately, Elias Vance rose to his feet. He was not a tall man, but his posture was one of immense dignity. The hall fell silent once more, the mockery replaced by a predatory curiosity. They were a Colosseum crowd, and Finch was the emperor, about to give the signal for the lions to be released. Elias's pale blue eyes met Finch's, and for a fleeting moment the professor felt a flicker of unease. There was no madness in that gaze. There was only a profound, unshakable certainty that was more unnerving than any shouted threat. "My name is Elias Vance," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, carrying to the furthest corners of the vast hall without the aid of a microphone. It was a voice accustomed to quiet spaces, to the solitude of early mornings and late nights. "I did not pen the book. I spoke it, and you, Professor Finch, you stole it." The accusation was delivered not with heat, but with the simple, declarative force of a fact. A stone had been dropped into the placid pool of the evening, and the ripples were about to become a tidal wave. The injustice had been given a voice. A collective gasp went through the auditorium. The statement was so direct, so audacious, it momentarily stunned the crowd into silence. Finch's condescending smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. The janitor wasn't playing his assigned role. The fool was supposed to be flustered, incoherent, easily dismissed. He was not supposed to be composed. He was not supposed to be articulate. "Stole it?" Finch repeated, his voice booming with theatrical disbelief. He laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed unnaturally in the hall. "My dear man, you accuse me of plagiarism? Me? Do you have any idea who I am?" He spread his arms wide, encompassing the stage, the university, the entire world of letters. His ego filled the room, a palpable, suffocating force. "I have dedicated 20 years of my life to this text. I have written dozens of papers, given hundreds of lectures, debated the finest minds of our generation on its nuances. And you, a man who cleans the floors of this very institution, claims I stole it from him?" Elias remained standing, his expression unchanged. "The years you spent do not make it yours," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "They only measure the length of the lie." The quiet defiance was like a lit match tossed into a barrel of gasoline. Finch's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The mask of the charming intellectual slipped, revealing the snarling creature beneath. He was being challenged in his own temple in front of his own acolytes by an illiterate simpleton. It was intolerable. He decided to utterly and completely destroy him. "All right, Mr. Vance," Finch said, his voice cracking like a whip. "Let us test this claim. Let's put your supposed authorship to the proof." He strode over to the lectern and picked up a heavy, leather-bound copy of The Obsidian Mirror, the Deluxe Anniversary Edition. He held it up for all to see. "A writer knows his own words, does he not? They are like his children." He opened the book at random, his finger landing on a dense passage of text. "Here," he sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "Page 412, the chapter on epistemic uncertainty. A simple task for the true author. Read it. Read the first paragraph for us all. Let us hear your voice give life to your magnificent prose." He thrust the book toward Elias. The audience leaned forward as one. This was the moment of execution. The trap had been sprung. They all knew, or thought they knew, what would happen next. The man would stammer, he would make excuses, he would be exposed as a fraud and a madman. Elias looked at the book, at the elegant, swirling fonts printed on the creamy page. To him, they were nothing more than intricate, meaningless patterns. A beautiful, impenetrable wall. He looked up from the page and met Finch's triumphant gaze. "I cannot," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. A wave of victorious murmurs swept through the crowd. Finch's smirk returned, wider and more vicious than before. "You cannot? What a shame! Has the great author forgotten how to read?" The joke landed with cruel precision. Laughter, sharp and mocking, erupted from all corners of the hall. It was the laughter of the pack, tearing at a wounded animal. "No," Elias replied, his voice cutting through the noise, silencing it once more. "I never knew how. I cannot read. Not that page. Not any page." The confession hung in the air, a statement of such bizarre contradiction that it left the audience momentarily speechless. A man who claimed to have written one of the most intellectually demanding books of the century was admitting he was illiterate. The absurdity was staggering. Finch threw his head back and roared with laughter, a genuine, unrestrained bellow of triumph. He had won. He had utterly humiliated the fool. "He cannot read," Finch choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. He addressed the audience, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, behold the author of The Obsidian Mirror, an illiterate genius, a modern-day Shakespeare who is apparently unfamiliar with the alphabet. What a story! What a magnificent, pathetic delusion!" The public humiliation was complete. Elias stood alone, bathed in the harsh stage lights, a solitary figure against a tidal wave of scorn. He was a joke, a madman, a pathetic footnote in the legend of Alistair Finch. The professor, seeing his opponent broken, moved in for the final devastating blow. He would not just defeat him, he would erase him. Finch's face hardened, the last vestiges of humor vanishing. He jabbed a finger at Elias, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You are not just a liar, sir. You are a trespasser and a disruption. You have interrupted a private academic event with your insane ramblings. You have slandered my name and my reputation." He turned and snapped his fingers at the two uniformed campus security officers standing discreetly by the stage entrance. "Officers, I want this man removed from the premises immediately. He is unstable. I want a restraining order filed. I want him barred from this campus for life." The two officers, burly men with impassive faces, began to move forward. They walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of men paid to handle trouble. The audience watched, their amusement curdling into a grim fascination. They were about to witness the final physical assertion of authority, the system correcting an anomaly, the madman being cast out from the temple of reason. Elias watched them approach. He did not brace himself. He did not plead. Instead, a profound sadness settled in his eyes. He had known this was a possibility, but the reality of it was still a heavy weight. To be silenced, to be thrown out, to have the last piece of himself, the words he had given to the world, locked away from him forever by the very man who held the key. In the 10th row, a young woman watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of horror. Dr. Eris Thorne was a postdoctoral fellow in the philosophy department, a recent graduate who had practically built her own doctoral thesis on the foundations of The Obsidian Mirror. She had idolized Alistair Finch, but meeting him in person had been a jarring experience. The man was arrogant, dismissive, a stark contrast to the humble, inquisitive, and deeply humane voice that echoed through the pages of his supposed masterpiece. There was a dissonance she could never reconcile. Now, watching the quiet, dignified old man on the stage, she felt that dissonance sharpen into a physical pain. She saw the way Elias Vance stood, his quiet endurance in the face of such overwhelming cruelty. She saw his eyes, and they did not hold the flickering, frantic energy of a lunatic. They held the deep, still water of a conviction so absolute it required no external validation. And a thought, terrifying and thrilling, began to form in her mind. What if he was telling the truth? As the security guards closed in on Elias, a memory surfaced in Eris's mind. She had a first edition of The Obsidian Mirror, a rare copy she'd found in a dusty used bookstore. The preface in that edition was different from the later ones. It had been written, supposedly by Finch, and contained a short, cryptic dedication that had been removed from all subsequent printings. It read, "For C.B. at Blackwood, who heard the voice when I was just the pen." It was a line she had always found strange. Finch portraying himself as a mere transcriber. It was completely out of character. Finch was still ranting from the stage, his voice a venomous torrent of self-aggrandizement and legal threats. This is what happens when we indulge the fantasies of the broken-minded. We give them a platform, and they try to tear down what men of intellect have built. He will be made an example of. The guards were now only a few feet from Elias. One of them reached out a hand to take his arm. At that moment, as the physical force of the institution was about to silence him, Elias's mind retreated from the harsh glare of the auditorium. The shouting, the scorn, the approaching guards, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. He was transported back, decades earlier, to a world of pain and silence. He remembered the screech of tires on wet asphalt, a sound that sliced the night in two. He remembered the impossible crystalline moment of impact, the world shattering into a spiderweb of fractured glass. He had been a young man then, a doctoral candidate himself, his mind a blazing furnace of ideas. He had been on the cusp of his own breakthrough, a unified theory that danced just at the edge of his understanding. He could read 1,000 pages in a day, his brain consuming and synthesizing information with a terrifying velocity. The world of text was his home, his playground, his entire universe. The accident took that universe from him. He woke up in a hospital bed to a world he no longer recognized. The shapes were the same, the colors were the same, but the meaning had been scoured from them. He looked at the get well card on his bedside table, and the words written on it were alien hieroglyphs. He looked at the headline of a newspaper and saw only a scramble of black marks. The part of his brain that translated symbols into sense had been irrevocably broken. The diagnosis was profound alexia. He would never read again. The doctors told him it was a miracle he was alive. But, as the weeks turned into months, it felt like a curse. His brilliant mind was trapped, locked inside a skull it could no longer communicate through. He would sit for hours in front of a typewriter, his fingers hovering over the keys, the words screaming in his head, but he could no longer form the bridge between the thought and the symbol. It was a unique and horrific form of solitary confinement. But the accident had given him something in return, a bizarre, almost supernatural compensation. While the door to reading had been slammed shut, another had been thrown wide open. His memory, always sharp, had become something else entirely. It was perfect, absolute, eidetic. He could recall conversations verbatim from years past. He could reconstruct entire rooms in his mind's eye, down to the last dust mote. And the theories, the ideas that had been brewing in his mind before the crash, they were still there, not as fading concepts, but as perfectly preserved structures of thought, crystalline and complete. He had to get them out. It was not a desire. It was a biological imperative. The pressure of the unsaid thoughts was a physical pain. He began to speak. He spoke to his wife, Eleanor, for hours, for days, for weeks. He dictated his magnum opus to her, pacing their small living room, his eyes closed in concentration as he pulled the fully formed sentences, the complex paragraphs, the intricate chapters, from the flawless archive of his mind. Eleanor, a patient, loving soul, sat with a tape recorder, capturing every word. They filled dozens of cassette tapes. It was a slow, arduous process. His voice would grow hoarse, his throat raw, but the ideas kept flowing. That was the Obsidian Mirror. Not a book written with pen and paper, but a cathedral of thought built with breath and sound, captured on magnetic tape. When it was finished, they had a box full of cassettes, a life's work. Eleanor painstakingly typed the manuscript from the recordings, her fingers flying across the keys of their old electric typewriter. Elias couldn't read the pages she produced, but he didn't need to. He knew what they said. He remembered every syllable. They sent the manuscript, a colossal 1,000-page stack of paper, to Blackwood Press, a small, prestigious publisher known for taking risks on bold new ideas. They addressed it to the founder, Caspian Blackwood, a man with a reputation for spotting genius. For months they heard nothing. Then a letter arrived. Blackwood Press was interested. They had assigned a junior academic reviewer to assess the manuscript, a young, hungry, and brilliant man named Alistair Finch. Finch was a revelation. He called them, effusive in his praise. He understood the work on a level no one else had. He spoke of its genius, its revolutionary power. He became their champion, their only link to the publishing world. And then tragedy struck again. Eleanor, his beloved Eleanor, his hands, his bridge to the world, suffered a sudden aneurysm. She was gone in an instant. Elias was adrift, completely untethered. Finch handled everything. He assured the grieving, disoriented Elias that he would see the project through. He said Eleanor's last wish was for the book to be published. He took the tapes, the original manuscript, everything. He said it was for safekeeping. A few months later, Finch called again. He told Elias a lie, a devastating, soul-crushing lie. He said the publisher had rejected the book. It was too dense, too unconventional. It would never be published. A year later, Elias was in a bookstore, dusting shelves as part of his new job as a cleaner when he saw it. The cover was stark and black, with elegant silver lettering, The Obsidian Mirror, and beneath it the author's name, Professor Alistair Finch. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound it almost stopped his heart. Finch had not only stolen his work, he had stolen Eleanor's legacy. He had erased them both. The memory faded, and the harsh lights of the auditorium snapped back into focus. A guard's hand was on his arm. The touch was firm, impersonal. It was the touch of institutional power, dismissing him, discarding him. But in the 10th row, Eris Thorne was already moving. The name, C.B. at Blackwood. Caspian Blackwood. He was a legend, long retired but surely findable. She slipped out of her aisle seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was professional suicide. Challenging Alistair Finch was like challenging the sun, but the image of Elias's face, the quiet dignity in his eyes, compelled her. She couldn't let this happen. She fumbled with her phone as she hurried into the grand, empty lobby. The university's Wi-Fi was slow, agonizingly slow. She searched for Caspian Blackwood. There were articles, interviews, a philanthropic foundation. No personal number. Of course not. She tried the Blackwood Press main line, but it was after hours. An answering machine. Desperate, she searched for the foundation. There was a number, a direct line for major donors. It was a long shot, a wild, insane gamble. She dialed, her hand shaking. It rang once, twice. She expected a voicemail. Hello? The voice on the other end was old, crackly, but sharp. It was the voice of a man who did not suffer fools. Mr. Blackwood? Eris stammered, her own voice barely a whisper. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. I know this is an incredible imposition, but I am at the Atherton Auditorium. Professor Alistair Finch is giving a lecture on the obsidian mirror." "Finch," the old voice grunted with clear distaste. "A peacock of a man. What about him?" "There is another man here," Eris said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "His name is Elias Vance. He says he is the true author of the book. Finch is having him thrown out. He publicly humiliated him, mocked him because Mr. Vance says he can't read." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then a long, profound silence. Eris's heart sank. She had made a mistake. She had sounded like a lunatic. "What did you say his name was?" Blackwood's voice was suddenly different. It was no longer just sharp. It was dangerously focused. "Vance," Eris repeated. "Elias Vance." Another pause, then, "And he said he can't read. Did he say anything else? Did he say he remembers it?" Eris's mind raced. Had he said that? Yes. Before, Finch had demanded he read from the book. He said, "I do not need to read it. I remember it." A soft, heavy sigh came through the phone. It was a sound of ancient regret. "My God," Caspian Blackwood whispered. "After all these years, it was true." The line went quiet for a moment, and Eris could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling, a decisive thud. "Dr. Thorne, where are you exactly?" "Atherton Auditorium, main campus. Do not let them remove that man. Stall them. I don't care how you do it. I'm on my way." The line went dead. The call was answered. The turning point had been reached. Caspian Blackwood, a man who moved in circles of power and influence that Alistair Finch could only dream of, hung up the phone. For a moment he sat in the deep leather chair of his study, the past rushing back at him like a physical blow, the manuscript from nowhere, the strange story about a reclusive, injured author, the cassettes. He had listened to one of them, just one. The voice on the tape was clear, calm, and brilliant, and the ambitious young reviewer, Finch, had been so convincing. He had said the author, Vance, had passed away. He had presented a forged document, a supposed last will and testament, granting him the rights. Blackwood, busy and trusting, had been deceived. It was the single greatest regret of his long career. He picked up another phone, a private line. He made 2 calls. The first was to the president of the university, a man who served on 2 of Blackwood's foundation boards. The conversation was brief and brutal. The second was to the senior partner of his law firm, a man known for his surgical precision in corporate litigation. The instructions were simple. Bring the Finch file, bring a team, and meet him at the university in 20 minutes. A powerful, overwhelming force had been mobilized. A reckoning, decades in the making, was now in motion. Back in the auditorium, the 2 security guards had taken Elias by the arms. He did not resist. There was no point. He had tried, and he had failed. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on his back, a mixture of pity, scorn, and morbid curiosity. Finch stood on the stage, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk on his face. He was the king of his castle, having successfully repelled a peasant uprising. "Let this be a lesson," Finch began, his voice sanctimonious. "A lesson in the importance of truth, of credentials, of—" He was cut off by a deafening bang. The grand oak doors at the back of the auditorium had been thrown open with such force that they slammed against the stone walls. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Every head in the hall whipped around. The audience gasped. Framed in the doorway stood a figure who commanded instant authority. He was an old man, leaning on a silver-headed cane, but he stood with the ramrod posture of a general. It was Caspian Blackwood. He was flanked on one side by the university president, whose face was a mask of pale, sweaty terror, and on the other by 3 individuals in razor-sharp suits who radiated an aura of predatory, legal menace. The procession began to move down the central aisle, their synchronized, measured steps echoing on the marble floor. It was not an entrance. It was an invasion. The room, which moments before had been filled with Finch's pompous voice, was now utterly, deathly silent. Finch stared, his mouth agape. He recognized Caspian Blackwood. He recognized the university president. A cold, reptilian fear began to crawl up his spine. What was happening? Why were they here? This was his night, his triumph. The procession did not stop at the front row. They walked directly to the foot of the stage, ignoring Finch completely. Caspian Blackwood's eyes, old but piercingly sharp, scanned the scene until they found Elias, still held loosely by the two bewildered guards. Blackwood's gaze softened. He bypassed the sputtering Professor Finch as if he were a piece of furniture. He mounted the 2 short steps onto the stage and walked directly to Elias. The guards, intimidated by the sheer power that had just entered the room, released Elias's arms and took a step back. Blackwood stopped in front of the quiet man in the simple work shirt. He looked at the calloused hands, the weary lines on his face. Then, in a gesture of profound, shocking respect that sent a ripple of astonishment through the entire auditorium, Caspian Blackwood bowed his head. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of his authority. It resonated through the silent hall. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person. I am Caspian Blackwood, and I have come tonight to offer you my deepest, most sincere apology." Finch's world tilted on its axis. He felt the blood drain from his face. Apology? To this? This nobody? "Mr. Blackwood, what is the meaning of this?" he stammered, taking a step forward. "This man is a delusional fraud. I was just having him removed." Blackwood turned his head slowly, fixing Finch with a look of such pure, undiluted contempt that the professor physically recoiled. "You," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a glacial whisper, "will be silent. Your time for speaking is over. For the next several years, I imagine your only meaningful dialogue will be with your lawyers." He turned back to the audience, his powerful voice filling the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed an injustice tonight, but the injustice you have seen is merely the final act of a betrayal that has lasted for 20 years. He gestured toward Elias. "This man, Elias Vance, is not a fraud. He is a genius, and he is, in fact, the one and only true author of The Obsidian Mirror." A tremor of shock and disbelief ran through the crowd. This was impossible. It had to be a prank, a piece of elaborate theater. "I know this is difficult to accept," Blackwood continued, his voice resonating with gravitas. "You know the book, but you do not know the story of its birth. It was not written by a professor in a comfortable, ivy-covered office. It was spoken, word by word, by a brilliant young man who had lost the ability to read or write due to a tragic accident. It was dictated onto a series of cassette tapes and transcribed by his devoted wife." Blackwood's gaze fell once more upon the trembling Finch. "Those tapes, along with the manuscript, were sent to my press, and I, in a moment of professional negligence, I shall regret to my dying day, entrusted them to a junior reviewer, a hungry, ambitious young man who saw an opportunity. This man," he pointed his cane directly at Finch, the silver head glinting like the tip of a spear, "told us the author had tragically passed away. He produced forged documents. He claimed it was the author's dying wish that he, the reviewer, should see the book into the world, under his own name, as a tribute. He stole another man's voice, another man's soul, and he has built a life, a career, a fortune, upon that despicable lie." One of the lawyers stepped forward and handed Blackwood a small portable cassette player. "We have the original tapes," Blackwood declared. "The original recordings of Mr. Vance dictating his masterpiece in his own voice." Finch was a statue of horror. His face, which had been red with anger, then pale with fear, was now a ghastly, waxy white. "Lies!" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. "All lies! It's a conspiracy. He's senile. This is my work. I wrote it. I wrote every word. Blackwood looked at him with something akin to pity. Your words have always been hollow, Alistair. You have been a brilliant parrot, but a parrot nonetheless. You could recite the words, but you never truly understood their heart, because their heart was never yours to understand. He turned to Elias. Mr. Vance, this man's pathetic denials are an insult to you, to your late wife, and to the truth. The world is listening now. They doubt you. They doubt the very words you gave them. Would you do us the honor? Elias Vance looked at Caspian Blackwood, and for the first time that evening, a faint, sad smile touched his lips. He nodded slowly. He did not need a book. He did not need a prompt. The entire text lived inside him, a permanent, indelible part of his being. He closed his eyes, took a shallow breath, and when he spoke, the voice that emerged was not the quiet, hesitant one from before. It was a voice transformed, imbued with the rhythm, the cadence, the sheer intellectual force of the work itself. Being, Elias began, and the single word silenced every rustle, every cough, every whispered doubt in the hall, is not a state, but a negotiation, a constant, violent arbitration between the particle of self and the wave of the cosmos. He continued. He recited the book's famous, notoriously difficult opening paragraph. Then the second. He did not stop. He recited the entire first chapter, word for perfect, resonant word. It was not a recitation. It was a channeling. The audience sat mesmerized, their skepticism melting away, replaced by profound and humbling awe. They were not hearing a man remembering words. They were hearing the source of the river, the complex syntax, the soaring metaphors, the dizzying intellectual leaps. They flowed from him not as memorized text, but as organic thought. It was undeniable. It was irrefutable. It was the truth, made manifest in sound. Alistair Finch watched, his body shrinking, collapsing in on itself. Every word Elias spoke was a hammer blow, shattering the foundations of his life. His reputation, his career, his identity, all of it was being publicly dismantled. He was a fraud, a ghost, a hollow man who had lived his life in a stolen skin. The sound of Elias's voice was the sound of his own annihilation. He sank into his chair at the side of the stage, a broken, pathetic figure, the boos and hisses of the audience now a rising tide that threatened to drown him. The vindication was absolute. When Elias finally fell silent, the last word of the chapter hanging in the air like a perfectly struck bell, the auditorium remained quiet for a beat, processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Then a single person began to clap. It was Eris Thorne, tears streaming down her face. Her applause was joined by another, then another, until the entire hall erupted in a thunderous, standing ovation. It was not applause for a performance, it was an act of collective apology, a roar of celebration for a truth that had been buried for 2 decades and had, at last, been resurrected. The 2 security guards, who moments before had been ready to physically eject Elias, now stood at a respectful distance, their faces etched with shame and awe. The university president, his career flashing before his eyes, rushed to Elias's side, stammering apologies, offering lifetime tenure, a building named in his honor, anything. It was a desperate, pathetic scramble to get on the right side of a history that had just been violently rewritten before his eyes. Alistair Finch was no longer a concern. As the applause thundered, Blackwood's legal team descended upon him. They served him with a lawsuit so thick it looked like a phone book, detailing counts of fraud, copyright infringement, and unjust enrichment. They informed him his assets were being frozen. The university president, seeing his cue, loudly announced that Professor Finch was suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation that would inevitably lead to his termination and the revocation of his degrees. Finch didn't even protest. He was hollowed out, a ghost in a bespoke suit. He was escorted from the stage, not by security, but by the silent, implacable lawyers who guided him out a side door and away from the scene of his own public execution. He vanished from the world he had commanded, not with a bang, but with the whimpering fizzle of a dying firework. Elias Vance, the eye of this sudden hurricane, remained calm. He was gently shielded by Caspian Blackwood and Eris Thorne, who flanked him like a protective honor guard. They guided him away from the clamoring academics and the flashing cameras of student journalists that had begun to appear. As they led him toward the same exit Finch had just been taken through, Elias paused. He looked back at the crowd, at the hundreds of faces looking at him with newfound reverence. He had not sought their adoration, only their acknowledgement. He had wanted his voice back, and now he had it. Just before they reached the door, he felt a strange compulsion. He stopped and turned to where Finch had been sitting, now an empty chair under the harsh lights. In his mind, he saw the man's face, not as the arrogant professor, but as the broken, terrified shell he had become. Elias felt a pang, not of triumph, but of a deep, sorrowful pity. He turned to Caspian Blackwood. "The words," Elias said, his voice soft again, the quiet man returning. "The words in the book are about how everything is connected, about how no part of the universe can be truly separate from another." He looked toward the empty chair. He was part of their story, even the ugly part. For 20 years he kept them alive when I could not. He was a poor guardian, but he was their only guardian. Blackwood looked at him, his ancient eyes filled with a profound respect. "You are a better man than he could ever dream of being, Mr. Vance." "It is not about being better," Elias said, a final, devastatingly wise lesson for an antagonist who could no longer hear it. "It is about being true." He forgot the difference. With that, he turned and allowed himself to be led away, leaving the world of Alistair Finch to collapse behind him. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Alistair Finch. The lawsuit filed by Blackwood Press on behalf of Elias Vance was a legal masterpiece, a blitzkrieg that left no room for defense. Finch's frozen assets were just the beginning. The court ordered an immediate injunction on all sales of The Obsidian Mirror bearing his name. His publisher, a larger house that had bought the rights from Blackwood years ago, dropped him instantly, issuing a public statement denouncing his fraud. Every honor he had received, every award that graced his mantelpiece was publicly rescinded. He became a pariah overnight, a leper in the academic community that had once worshipped him. The trial was a formality. The evidence of the original tapes, authenticated by multiple forensic experts, was irrefutable. Finch was stripped of every penny he had ever earned from the book, a sum that ran into the millions. He was forced to issue a public retraction and apology, a humiliating, ghost-written document that he read on the courthouse steps to a scrum of jeering reporters. He lost his home, his savings, his pension, but most of all, he lost his name. He became a footnote in Elias Vance's story, a cautionary tale whispered in university hallways about the mortal sin of intellectual hubris. He tried to write, to prove he had a voice of his own, but the pages remained blank. He had been a vessel for another man's genius for so long, he had nothing of his own left to say. He faded into a bitter, impoverished obscurity, haunted by the echo of a voice that was never his. The events at the Atherton Auditorium sent shockwaves through the academic world. The story of Elias Vance became a legend. The Obsidian Mirror was re-released by Blackwood Press within 6 months, with a new, beautiful cover bearing the name of its true author, Elias Vance. It contained a new foreword, written by Caspian Blackwood and Eris Thorne, detailing the incredible, tragic, and ultimately triumphant story of its creation. The book, already a classic, became a global phenomenon. It sold millions more copies, its profound message now imbued with the power of the human story behind it. The university, in an act of profound institutional penance, established the Vance Thorne Institute for Intellectual Integrity. Funded by a massive endowment from both the university and the royalties from the book, which Elias generously donated, the Institute's mission was twofold: to support and provide platforms for scholars and artists with disabilities, and to actively investigate and expose academic fraud. Dr. Eris Thorne, whose single act of courage had set the entire reckoning in motion, was appointed its first director. Her career, which she had risked that night, was not just saved. It was launched into the stratosphere. She became a leading voice for ethics and truth in academia, a testament to the power of one person daring to question authority. Elias Vance himself wanted no part of the fame. He was a quiet man, and he returned to a quiet life, albeit a far more comfortable one. He bought a small secluded house in the countryside with a garden that he tended with the same patience and care he had once applied to his ideas. He did not give interviews or go on talk shows. His work was his statement. He continued to write, dictating 2 more books to Eris Thorne, who became his trusted collaborator and dearest friend. They would sit for hours in his sun-drenched study, Elias pacing and speaking, Eris typing, capturing the thoughts of a mind that had been silenced for far too long. He remained a humble, unassuming paragon, his worth no longer a secret, but a celebrated fact. About a year after his public ruin, Alistair Finch sought Elias out. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. He was thinner, his expensive clothes now ill-fitting and worn. He found Elias sitting on a bench in his garden, watching the bees move among the flowers. "Mr. Vance," Finch said, his voice raspy, unused. Elias turned, his expression serene. He was not surprised to see him. "Professor," he replied with no irony or malice. I came to apologize," Finch stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "What I did to you. To your wife. It was a monstrous thing. There is no excuse. I was a thief, a coward. I was so empty inside, and your words, they were so beautiful. I wanted them to be mine. I wanted to be the man who could think such things. And for that, I am sorry. I am truly sorry." Elias listened, his pale blue eyes never leaving Finch's face. He watched the man who had stolen his life weep silently in his garden. He let the silence stretch, allowing the apology to settle in the space between them. "The apology is a start," Elias said finally, his voice gentle. "But it is just another set of words, Professor. It does not change the past. Forgiveness is not mine to give. You must earn it from yourself." "How?" Finch asked, his voice desperate. "How can I ever do that?" Elias looked away from Finch, toward the distant hills. "You spent 20 years living a lie. Perhaps it is time to spend the next 20 living a truth. A small one, an honest one. Find something that is truly yours, no matter how small, and build on that. What matters is not what you said then. It is not what you are saying now. What matters is what you do, from this day forward." He did not offer easy absolution. He did not offer a comforting embrace. He offered something far more valuable, a path, a difficult, uncertain path toward redemption, paved not with words, but with actions. Alistair Finch looked at the man whose life he had ruined, a man who showed him not hatred, but a sliver of grace, and he understood. He nodded, turned, and walked away, leaving Elias Vance in the quiet peace of his garden, a humble king who had finally reclaimed his kingdom.